Gender-based violence often seems too big an issue to tackle and too horrendous to engage with and overcome. It's a war, it's our pandemic, and yet sometimes it feels we have already lost. Well, with nearly 3,000 women murdered every year, it might be easier for many to just ignore the issue. But Professor Francis Peterson, rector and vice-chancellor at the University of the Free State, believes we already have the vaccine for gender-based violence, and it boils down to one word: respect. Professor Peterson joins me now to discuss the article he's written about this. Good evening, Professor. Thanks very much for your time. Now, you've taken that pandemic metaphor for GBV and you've extended it. You're suggesting there's a vaccine or a treatment, and that boils down to this one word: respect. Why?
Good evening, Sally. Yes, I've indicated in the article that we actually have already got a vaccine for gender-based violence, and that is respect. Gender-based violence boils down to sort of a basic human right, and as we're celebrating Women's Month in August, it's really sad to talk about GBV in this particular context. But it's how do you actually respect one another? And I think one would have assumed that in a society, respect would already be developed within the household as you live as a family. But then again, if you look at our societal ills, and specifically if you look at families within and households within South Africa, we've got a lot of broken families. And therefore, to expect that people already from an early age would learn how to respect one another is probably an assumption that we would take a little bit too far. But I do think that if we could, in our educational institutions, bring across that and how we engage with respect with one another, we could make a difference. And ultimately, it's also important to show how to do it. It is how do you actually set the example, and you build from there.
Yeah, I mean, that is the crux of it really, is how do we administer respect in a damaged and completely broken society in many ways? That's the real problem. That's the real discussion to be had, isn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. So I always argue that in a framework, and you can probably call, if you look at society as a framework as well, you could have legislation and you could have things that you could ask society or citizens to comply with. And then you could do the law to enforce that. But that doesn't actually talk to the fibre that's within you. And I often use the statement where people argue or people say that university campuses is in fact a microcosmos of what society is about. I changed it a little bit around and I said, no, I look at university campuses of what society should look like. And if we couldn't bring and affect that level of transformation, even in the values that we impart at university or post-school educational institutions, and for that matter schools as well, we actually fail as educators in developing that new generation of citizenship.
And it's so interesting, you know, it's got to be taught, and if the home is not teaching respect, it has to then be done, I suppose, at schools, at universities. But these are exact places where, according to recent crime stats, women and girls are particularly unsafe. The damage is already done at that point.
Absolutely. So in fact, the Ministry of Higher Education and Training have recently launched a policy framework for gender-based violence for the post-school education sector. And in fact, it's also on the back of the numbers that has been increasing at universities and at TVET colleges and institutions of higher learning. But I think there's three things that's for me important. There is the level of awareness that we bring across on our campuses. What is about, why it happened, what are the reasons for that, and how do we actually start to change that sort of mindset and how we looked at it. So it's that awareness and prevention. The second part is to create an enabling environment And this is, how does your policies look like? How do you live your practices at the university in everything that you do? Not only in related to gender-based violence, but in related to safety in general, in related to human rights. So if you only focus on one in a discrete manner, you're not going to bring that level of respect across, the level of care across, because people will identify somewhere else that you're not doing it and you're not consistent. So for me, that's the second part. And the third part that is also quite crucial is the part of how do we actually monitor that? How do you make sure that if things happen, that you have a zero tolerance? So accountability, monitoring, and making sure that your practices keep on being renewed. That for me is what generally is lacking in our institutions. And I think if we start to do that, we have got a slight chance to deal with the issue of respect.
And none of them are quick fixes, you know, and I think this is the thing. There are no quick fixes. I was speaking to a man earlier who has a support group for men who've been sexually abused, and he was saying one of the most important things is that men need to be given permission to start talking about the violence perpetrated against them. Men need to be able to open up, and men need to be solving this problem alongside women. But, you know, awareness and prevention, enabling environment, getting the right policies and monitoring, that requires consistent attention, consistent focus. How are you making it work at your university? Is it working? Where's it going wrong?
Well, I think I wouldn't say it's completely working, but I think we're making progress. One of the things that we also introduced, and I just want to cite this as an example, and I'm going to come back to responding to your specific question, is we've developed about 2 years ago what we call the Sexual Assault Response Team. And that response team was put together to bring as a one-stop shop medical care, the legal fraternity, the counseling services, so that when you have a victim that has been sexually abused or sexually harassed, that you don't maximize the trauma that individual have, but you actually try to minimize it by having all of these together and deal with the victim. So to be able to deal with it, it is a consistent living out of that specific framework that you develop. And you must always say, what can I do to maintain that momentum? So it's not one specific aspect that's going to get you there. It's a combination, but I think the pinnacle of that is the pinnacle of respect. And if all of those things can be put together and to drive consistent awareness, discussion, creating environments where people can talk, in your face type of placards that say, well, gender-based violence, safety and health and well-being is crucially important for our institution and for the sector. So Sally, it's a continual working on and try to use ambassadors as well that come out of the student cohort, out of the staff cohort, to share what is important. So there isn't one silver bullet, but I do think that if respect isn't there, we're going to go backwards.
You're absolutely right, and thank you so much for your time this evening, Professor Francis Peterson, Rector and Vice-Chancellor of the University of the Free State.